So let's take a look at the activity on the internet over the last week or so here. And first item at the top of the list in terms of the number of anomalies that we've identified, scan probes on port 18186 TCP. Now this is associated with an occupational health services application, but I'm not so sure that this is actually what's being targeted in this particular case. Did a little bit of research on this, and there are some other applications that use this port. One, namely, is associated with checkpoint firewall, and it has something to do with some secure internal communications or OPSEC function associated with the checkpoint firewall. I'm not exactly privy to the specifics about that, but the significance here is I think perhaps what they're looking for is systems that have this sort of service exposed. I don't know if there'd be a vulnerability associated with it they're looking for or something along those lines, but nevertheless. Most of the probes in this case are from China. And we have some evidence of successful connections. So there apparently is some sort of an application out there that's responding on this port. Whether I've correctly identified that application or not is, I guess, left up to our listeners to investigate a little bit further. Next item here is, and John, you reported on this last week, scan probes on port 135 TCP. This is endpoint map associated with, or mapper service associated with Microsoft Windows. We used to see scanning on this port all the time. It basically disappeared, I think subsequent to the configure basically being disabled. We haven't seen a whole lot of that activity going on. What we are seeing here is most probes from multiple addresses in China. That is, most of the activities originating from China, not exclusively, but most of it. It continues to use source port 445 TCP. That's 4,445 TCP, which is I'm not sure that's really associated with any specific application, but it could be just a source port to make the scanning process more efficient. There is some potential relationship to the probes that we just talked about here on 18186 TCP, but that's only, that could be a sort of a circumstantial indication that we've seen so far. But
so yeah, I was looking at some of this traffic actually, and for the 135 TCP, and like you said, they're using a static source port 445 TCP to scan, and when they get a connection, they'll make another connection with a different, it's a real connection. The source port's ephemeral, and they're making a connection, a DCE RPC connection, trying to authenticate as an administrator. I'm not sure what they're connecting because I got to still look at it. I only had a few minutes this morning to look at it, and I'm not an expert on the DCE RPC protocol. But they're trying to authenticate, make a RPC connection to the machine, and all the cases that I actually saw were not authenticated, so they didn't have the right password. So it might be some kind of password guessing attack via this. I don't know. Yeah, I didn't have enough of a volume to really see what was going on there, but that's all I know right now is in terms of what they're doing.
I guess my biggest observation is why the heck are these things exposed to the internet in the first place?
And there aren't that many of them, from what, or at least what I saw.
Relatively speaking.
Relatively to the amount of scanning going on, it's a micro fraction of ones that are actually responding, which is good. But there still are some out there that are responding correctly, so they are out there listening on port 135. And why would be the question. And
just to give you a little bit of the, sort of the evidence that suggests that it might be related to 18186 TCP scan, exact same kind of behavior. That is, once they connect, I mean, they're starting with a fixed source port, different port in this case, but static source port, and then going to sort of a randomly assigned ephemeral port if they actually make the connection. I suspect that this is behavior, so what I used to refer to as a sort of a network reflector telescope. That is, you can have sort of an array of servers that are spraying out these probes using a spoof source, and then one server kind of sitting there waiting to get the responses, and then based on the response, use that to trigger a real connect. We've seen a lot of behavior like this. It's a way to get the aggression index, which we'll talk about a little bit later, up to a higher level.
And we've seen that static source port a lot with tools like ZMAP and MassScan, because they're really just kind of passively listening on that port for packets coming back. They're not really, they do handshake, but they don't do it in a normal way through the TCP stack.
And that's to minimize having to keep session for every single packet.
Right. They kind of maintain their own state, basically.
Yeah. Next item here, we are observing some scan probes on port 7778 TCP. This happens to be associated with the Oracle HTTP server. So this is an administrative interface into Oracle database platform. We typically see surges in the scanning activity around the time when Oracle submits or basically provides some patches or updates, in which case they're generally identifying information about those patches, which generally is indicating some vulnerabilities that have been discovered and subsequently patched. This is a fairly regular activity. Most of the probes in this case from China as well. Like I said, seems to be a fairly regular routine, a quarterly routine that we've seen taking place. Now, if we take a look at the top 10 most probed ports, no real significant changes this week, where there is one port that has come up the most here. And I'm sort of stealing something that John introduced last week here, is how the relative rankings have changed over the last week. And the biggest change here is on port 443, that's come up 6 notches from where it was last week. But it's not unusual to see port 443 being the most probed port, or in the top 10 most probed ports. The 400-pound gorilla here is that port 135 TCP activity that we were talking about. It really does show up as a big portion of this, roughly a third of the total. And then that's followed by port 22 TCP, which we know to be associated with brute force password guessing attacks, 1433, which is Microsoft SQL database, and then port 23, that's Telnet, again, brute force password guessing attacks, followed by port 445, port 80, port 443, as we said, jumped up several notches from last week. Port 53 UDP, looking for those DNS servers, and then last but not least, port 3389 TCP, which is a remote desktop protocol. And I don't remember the last time that wasn't on the top 10 list.
5900 slipped down. We don't see, as speaking of remote desktop type things, a lot of times for a while there we were seeing 5900,
Absolutely.
Which is VNC, similar type of protocol in our top 10, but I haven't seen it for the past few weeks or so.
Well, it could be it's number 11 or 12. It's probably very close to the top 10. We just have to take a look at that. I thought it would be useful. We talked about the aggression index. This is in terms of probing activities, and this is basically looking at the number of probes relative to the number of sources that are doing the probing. So basically what it suggests is if you have fewer sources and more probes, you're going to have a higher aggression index. It's fairly typical. Let's take the port 53 UDP here. That's a fairly typical aggression index, around somewhere between 5 and 6. I think a couple of weeks ago we pointed out that port 22 is seeing some pretty strong regression. It's a little bit over 6, about 6.4. And this port 135 TCP activity is way up to an aggression index of 7. And again, it's simply a ratio of how many probes we see relative to the number of source addresses that are doing the probing activity. So it does sort of suggest some optimization has been put into place to get more probes out there. Next item here, the top 10 most sources doing the probing. And very little change from last week. We have port 445 at the top of the list, followed by port 23, that's Telnet, and then followed by port 80 TCP, port 8080 TCP, basically an alternative or proxy port in effect. And then 27015, that's usually P2P associated with gaming activity. And then we see the port 16470 UDP, that's associated with the zero access botnet, which continues to diminish. And then last on this list is 17788 UDP. John, we were investigating this a little bit earlier.
Right. We saw this on the list last week as well. Right. And normally it's down lower, but I think it's in the top 20-ish usually. Right. But it's associated with this PP stream. It's a Chinese streaming television protocol. I don't really know much about it, but it's a peer-to-peer protocol too for streaming of TV programming.
Yeah, so that appears to be innocuous activity, and it appears to have some bumps up in the list. But P2P activity can show up in our, it appears a little bit like probing because you have a source that's making lots of connections out to lots of destinations. And in this case, it is significant enough that we're seeing some of the activity. So there's a lot of U.S. representation and a lot of Chinese representation in the participants here. But again, most likely innocuous. And I think perhaps when you get maybe some popular content available through there, it seems to drive up the participation, and it pops up into our list here. So again, we believe that's innocuous activity. But if you see that activity on your network, you might want to take a little bit of a closer look and verify that that's what you expect. And then we'll take a quick look at the daily reconnaissance index. And this is basically an indicator. It's supposed to be working like the inverse of the Dow Jones industrial average type thing. We like the Dow Jones to go up, particularly if you're investing. This is the opposite. We're seeing this reconnaissance index go up, and it's basically an indication that there's more probing activity on the network, which is not necessarily a good thing. Generally not, in fact. What we're seeing is actually the number of sources has gone down, relatively speaking, which is this sort of the blue band on the bottom, the top portion being the contribution in terms of the number of probes. This is a normalized index, by the way. We're way up here in the 60s, or high 50s, low 60s here. This is indicative, or this big sort of spike here is associated with that port 135 TCP activity that's basically additive to our normal probing activity we've seen. Just have a couple of slides here to share with you. We haven't talked about the reflection-based DDoS attack activity lately. I thought this would be sort of a good observation to share with you. The big problem, particularly near the end of 2013 and going into the beginning of 2014, has been this network time protocol. There was that monlist command that was being abused in no insignificant way to conduct attacks.
Very large reflection amount of bytes back that you would get from a monolith query.
Right. That activity has diminished significantly. And you know, there's been a lot of activity in the internet community to help correct the problem of the servers with this, basically this command exposed, and correct the number of servers that simply have NTP exposed that don't need to be NTP servers. So they've put a big dent in that. To dig into this a little bit further, this graph has obviously a pretty high Y scale here, up in around 50 gigabits per second. I thought it'd be useful to kind of cap off the scale. This is the same time period, but capping the scale so that we can zoom in and see the other contributions to these reflection attacks. We've talked a little bit about this before, but it's interesting to see what the big contributions are at this point. Well, let's start from the NTP, which is the yellow, obviously diminishing, in fact, almost insignificant in terms of denial of service attack activity now. The next one being the green one, which is character generator.
And really surprising.
Surprising, but apparently true that most of these attacks are using character generator as the most significant contribution to these denial of service attacks now. So, you know, I think this perhaps is just, there hasn't been enough attention given to this problem, and there are probably a lot of devices out there that are just answering to port 19 and, you know.
You know, when the NTP stuff kicked up, we were all kind of warning, like, hey, CareGen, we see a little bit of this kind of kicking up. It's definitely contributing to most of the activity at this point, so that's interesting.
Yeah, and then that's followed by DNS activity, that is using DNS for reflection attack activity. Now you can see this was back in February, DNS kind of peaked out, and then they basically steered away from that, went to using NTP as the preferred attack mode. It hasn't really picked up. There's been, you know, there's a little spike or a surge in activity here, and there is a portion of this activity that's legitimate. There's some, you know, legitimate DNS traffic in there. And then last but not least, perhaps, well, it is the least in this sense, but one that we want to be paying attention to, we basically hadn't seen much SNMP being used in denial of service attacks up until basically late March or so, or middle of March. And we've seen little attacks using that, and we've seen probing activity looking for those servers. But it certainly isn't any significance in terms of contribution relative to some of these others. So it's one we still want to keep an eye on, make sure that it doesn't turn into a big problem. So far,
I'm going to hope that the reason we don't see a lot of SNMP is because people have been smart and they don't set their community name to public. Because that would be the best way to kind of defeat this without having to disable SNMP altogether.
Yeah, well, there are two fundamental things here. I think, generally speaking, devices that have SNMP are better managed.
Right.
It's for the purpose of managing it. Whereas some of these other things like character generator, they're unmanaged devices, or somebody just sets up a Linux server, and I think in many cases it might be in fact just the internet connected devices that they just haven't been well designed or implemented. Whereas the SNMP thing, not so many servers out there comparatively speaking, and there is that, you know, getting to the community string that's associated with that device before you really can get a big response out of it.
Right. And I'll stare into my crystal ball and say that there's one other that I'm worried about, and it's SSDP is another one that I don't remember exactly what that stands for, maybe Simple Service Discovery Protocol, but it's another one of these UDP protocols that can respond back with a decent sized packet. I don't think there's a lot of them out there, so that might help in terms of it not being well used. But we've definitely seen some of that activity.
Mm-hmm.
But it's probably not even on this chart yet.
Well, we've seen a lot of probing activity for it, not a lot of attack activity associated with it. So we need to keep an eye on it and make sure it doesn't transition into the latter.
Right.